無 Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, the creator of the Vagrant Sun motif, the Vagrant SRD, and, well, Vagrant Sun. A lot of vagrants here. The one and only Wøde. I'm hoping I got that pronounced right.
Wøde. Yeah, Wøde. It's. There are so many ways to pronounce it. All of them are correct, but it's Wøde.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you think with the amount of mythology of certain isles that I'd have that down pat, but I find ways to surprise people. How you doing? Well, today in your case.
I'm having a fantastic time. I'm so excited to talk TTRPGs at any opportunity, especially with fellow TTRPG designers, and to give a bit of my perspective, talk a bit about my game and my setting and all of that good stuff. But just anything that comes up that feels good to talk about. Conversation is really important in the tabletop game space.
Mm-hmm. So I'll start with the tradition around here, which is the humble beginnings. So, walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
To role-playing games, wow, there's a small history that I have with role-playing games that begins with being a super nerdy, lonely kid with not a lot of friends that wanted to play role-playing games. All of my friends in high school in particular were massive first-person shooter nerds. If we were playing games or playing COD, if we were talking about anything, it was anything aside from RPGs. My first RPG that I ever played, I actually was sitting, I had sort of like a daycare person, a nanny, and her sons had a Nintendo 64 and were playing Zelda on it constantly. Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, the OG classic. It took me years to play it, but the myth of that fantastical realm in my head stuck with me for years onwards. So that kind of birthed just sort of a love of role-playing games, in particular Japanese role-playing games, JRPGs. Nowadays, I will play anything if it says it has a 100-hour playtime on it. I will play it for at least 50 hours, guaranteed. But because I was playing a lot of single-player games growing up, I gravitated, of course, towards Legend of Zelda, but then to the Elder Scrolls, to Final Fantasy games from about 7 onwards, especially 9 and 10, my favorites at the time. Growing up and playing other games, understanding games like the Dark Souls series, the Shin Megami Tensei series, all of these games are really branded as more dark than fantastical, those kind of things. Really deeply interested in the character and story of those things. But when I finished high school, I got really, really interested in the idea of playing games that that you'd made yourself. I didn't have anyone to play like a tabletop game with, but I really wanted to. So I started building my own, basically card-based systems where I would, I'd buy a couple of starter decks of Magic the Gathering cards. I'd pull out a couple of cards that look cool and use them as like monsters for encounters, and I would build sort of very, very simple role-playing game around them that I would play maybe with 1 or 2 people. But that sort of the beginning shell of what would eventually become the early days of Vagrant Sun, my game system. Purely out of necessity. I was a very lonely RPG gamer for most of my early upbringing, but going on ahead into my 20s, I began to meet a lot of people through university. I went to Japan for a good long period of time and met a lot of people there. My wife of almost 10 years, she's also really, really into role-playing games with me as well. And so we started to play more often until eventually I kind of just reached this critical mass that I just decided that my entire personality would be about writing fantasy and playing RPGs. So now I spend as much time as I can, especially trying to meet people online to play new games, understand new stuff. Lots of MMOs. I love playing MMOs. I played all of those old, really low quality but free to play Korean MMOs for a good long period of time, just because it was something to play.
Did you ever play a mud?
What's that?
Did you ever play a mud?
No, I didn't actually. I never had a good computer up until probably I was 21. I'm old enough that we didn't have good functioning internet until I was right at the end of high school, like 17, 18 years old. So I missed the popularity of playing MUDs, which is a shame because nowadays I can't get enough of sort of researching it and reading up on stuff nowadays. But it definitely would have been the perfect starting point, but I sort of scraped on past that.
But all of those you would have gotten a kick out of. I feel like you would have got a kick out of Space Station 13 during its run.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that kind of stuff that I think I was searching for a good number of years, and never sort of. I never had the right sort of community of people to be like, here's a really cool thing that I think you would like. Often finding stuff for myself, but in the last 5 years, finding tabletop role-playing game communities online. Prior to 2018, I was dead set that my sort of main goal in life was to be a full-time practicing recording artist, musician, and was writing music and doing that whole thing, skilling up. I'm an audio tech, I suppose, by trade, doing like microphones and sound engineering. But in the last 5 years or so, pivoted very heavily into the tabletop game space, simply because of the personal investment, but also just the people that I was meeting. Really cool people that were very encouraging, that liked the stuff that I was coming up with. Met a lot of people that were more local in my part of Australia. And in and around all of the stuff to do with D&D, eventually I was conned into trying to basically create a very hackable version of a character sheet that you could use for pretty much any D20 system. And that ended up being playtest 1 of Vagrant SRD, the system reference document for Vagrant Sun, my full game, which is still in production at the moment. But it was simply out of necessity. I was making homebrew material for Pathfinder and for 5th edition D&D, and then that became less and less easy. My stuff became so setting specific that it was hard to put on DM's Guild without them flagging it as sort of non-core content, all that good stuff. But basically wrote 5 parts of playtest, how to make a character in this new system, just for mostly the enjoyment of it. And in the last 12 months, I did like a big rebranding. I set up a new studio for myself at home, and sort of rebranded myself as, pursuing independent publishing. So now I have 11 parts of playtest material for Vagrant SRD, everything from character creation to like custom spells and subclasses and character origins and all of that good stuff. That is the building blocks for my game, which all started out of necessity and now is basically a functioning game system with a Creative Commons license and a fully hackable game that I'm really proud of. But yeah, that's the journey from RPGs to Vagrant Sun.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. And with some of the ones that you had mentioned, that's interesting to me because I've had some interactions in that direction. Throughout last month and a good amount of December, I was covering 2 Shin Megami Tensei TTRPGs, one official translated and one fan translated.
Yeah. I actually was I was cruising through some of your YouTube stuff, and that was the first thing that stuck out to me was the SMT tabletop game. I thought that was incredible concept. It's wildly interesting. A great game that could absolutely work on the table.
Yeah, and it's one that can certainly work. The big stumbling point has always been how you handle demon fusion, because there's a lot of math in the video games on how it works, and it is a bit crunchy in both Tokyo Conception and 2000X, but there was no way it was going to be not crunchy. It is a case of being the best kind of situation that you could get out of that. But I've spoken at length about how I find the Japanese TTRPG scene fascinating, but Tokyo Conception is based on Nocturne, which I think was a lot of people's first introduction to Mega 10, and their first introduction to Mega 10 breaking them. Because
absolutely, everybody has had their first experience with it. Was either Matador from SMT3. My first full SMT playthrough was SMT4 on the 3DS, and so it was actually the Minotaur was my first like real SMT moment at the end of Naraku. But everyone has their experience of the game breaking and going, wait, hang on a second, I thought this game was fun, and now I'm just sucking. What's going on?
In the process of researching for that, I ended up going down a massive rabbit hole when it came to the history of Mega 10, going all the way back to the original novels from like the late 80s. The Digital Devil Story novels, which are completely insane.
Yes, absolutely.
And the fact that Atlas wasn't even the first people to get a hold of adapting Digital Devil Story. The first one was Telenet. They did one game that was released on both the MSX and the PC-98 engine. The latter is better, kind of, but it plays more like Gauntlet than the dungeon crawls everyone's familiar with. And playing those early ones gave me had forced me to develop a psychotic hatred for Loa and Succubus.
That is a very specific hatred, I will say that, but I understand it from the perspective of that game. Yeah, definitely.
Any monster that has a level down effect is automatically on my shit list.
Yes, absolutely. Well, famously, the only experience I have of that is playing the original Demon Souls game, where, of course, one of the last bosses will level you down as well. And if that's your first experience of it, right at the end of the game, the game wants to hurt you.
Yeah.
Anything that levels you ruins your character build. The game is fighting against you tooth and nail to get you to stop playing it out of frustration.
I think it's important to note that both games trace their lineage to Wizardry. Wizardry has a legendary spot in gaming history, but it is not a nice game. The game outright hates you.
Well, I mean, it is very interesting thinking of games in the time and place that they're built, because especially like games as a product, anything that is designed to be played is designed to be played over a long period of time. They want you to, invest. They want you to invest money in an arcade machine. They want you, there's only 5 levels in the game, so they want you to have to go back to the start because one bit's really hard. They put, bottlenecks in.
Nintendo hard is a thing mainly because Nintendo would only license a certain amount of times per year to third parties. I think it was like 9 games a year is what you could get away with.
Yes.
Because they wanted to avoid a market flood that was one of the things that caused that crash in the 80s. Granted, there were still unlicensed games, but that was always going to happen. Nothing you can do about that.
These games, you do begin to understand how that mine's difficulty by necessity just being a thing. And a lot of these old games that we love nowadays that have got their modern versions, in Shin Megami Tensei games. But also how it's pulled in from other different IPs, and you can see the early role-playing game aesthetics of games like Wizardry sort of feeding into new things, because the people that made these games played Wizardry back in the day, and for them that's what symbolizes difficult games and what people might be looking for. And I think there's fun to be had in that. There's, if not every game is designed to hold your hand. You don't need to walk into something knowing that you'll finish it, because games can just be fun because they're an interesting challenge that you get to master and overcome.
Yeah, and I will admit I have a bit of respect for devs who are aware that a given game is hard, and they're like, you knew what you signed up for, so I've got no sympathy.
Yes, exactly.
And
I think when people want something out of a game because they're going to expect it, we always have to remember that people aren't just making games specifically for us, They're making them for many, many, many people, and it's a product that lots of different people will take. And if you wanted a specific thing, you wanted a cozy, easy ride, there are other games you can play. You can drop the difficulty down on a game and nobody's going to stop you. But these games are designed in such a way for a specific experience, which is exactly the kind of thing you get out of a tabletop game.
Yeah, that's,
we're curating a specific experience for the people that are playing it.
Yeah, that's kind of why I roll my eyes whenever I see a bunch of journalists demanding that a given Souls-like needs an easy mode. Because they don't, because I think in those kind of situations they don't realize how just adding an easy mode snowballs into a whole host of new questions you've got to answer in terms of implementing that as well, because so much of the content and design in those kind of games is purpose built for one particular style. And
yes, absolutely.
It's I call it an all roads lead to Rome kind of thing. And like if you just messed around with say how much damage enemies do, that's going to lead into a snowball effect.
Yes.
And I know this because I've seen it happen. I remember when there was a lot of debate about adding in sprint in Halo Reach, and just the armor abilities as a whole. And
yes,
a lot of people would think, oh, what's the big deal if you're just allowing people to run? The problem is now you're putting in two different movement speeds into a type of game where positioning and map control is paramount.
Exactly. And it's so easy to tell that the person who is the most mobile, that is choosing to play the game in a particular way, is going to be better off than the person who doesn't use those skills.
Yeah, pretty much. And when it comes to the armor abilities, I was always of the idea that a lot of them are too useful for their own good. And the line when it comes to that is when they're stepping on other people's toes, like say the drop shield. Because Reach had brought back the whole shield and health system, so you have a way to recover, but you can't make too many mistakes. But if you got the drop shield, you can just drop that anywhere you want and get health back.
Yeah.
So it kind of invalidates the whole presence of the shield, and that kind of thing is something that has to be mindful of as a designer, even in tabletop. I've used the issues when it comes to casters in some games as an example. You probably saw it, but I did a whole video about why I don't care for the Vancian spells per day model, because of that limitation, it's used as justification for spells being so overly powerful to the point where a caster is like a whole party by themselves.
Yes, yeah. I bookmarked that to look at, because I definitely agree with the sentiment. I was just thinking, because thinking back to the whole SMT game, trying to emulate the Demon Fusion system. It's so clearly that there are like when you slap extra systems and extra mechanics onto a game, you have to be mindful about the ways in which they interact with all the other things, and it's got to start from the ground level. When you add more mechanics onto something, it has to be mindful of how it changes the rest of the game. Because most of the time you have to make compromises. You add a sprint button to something. How does that change the flow of combat? If you add the ability to heal over time or to instantly get heals, how does that change the flow of a game? Or in the case of spell slots, is a perfect example. If you add some sort of spell rationing, some sort of a liquid currency in the form of spell slots that you basically have tons of throughout the day, with the caveat that but they only last per day. Well, the game, for the most part, most tables will play only over the course of a day, so it's actually not a limitation at all. So when you say something is like, this, here's the drawback for it, it's only a drawback in a specific situation, and having to try and build for that is an impossible task if it's like being tacked onto it. And I think spell slots is a classic example of something that has only been brought forward in time into more modern games, because it's like a hallmark of an old game. It's something people recognize, not necessarily something that benefits the game as a whole.
That's tradition for its own sake, which doesn't really help. Like, I don't think tradition for its own sake is a good enough reason to have something in a given game.
Yes, I agree.
especially since Stanley had once said every comic is someone's first, and I think a similar sentiment can be applied to games, whether it be video game or tabletop.
Yes.
Yeah, you're going to have some games that are most definitely played by more veterans, but every game is potentially someone's first. No matter how obscure that game might be, this is still the case. Now, shifting into things, when it comes to the way Vagrant has developed over time, was Vagrant built as a universal leaning affair, or was it built with was the world built first and then the rules were built?
Interesting that you asked that, because I actually thought quite a lot about this today. You know, when it comes to talking about Vagrant Sun, I almost exclusively talk about it through the lens of a GM. You know, running the game as a GM for other people, and like most nerds, like the setting of Vagrant Sun was like my first setting that I then introduced people to play tabletop games with. And so there's something to be said that the setting came first, because it's what I wrote first. I remember writing my first couple of campaigns and story notes sitting in the back of the car on a long drive between, you know, it was like a 12-hour drive, and I wrote most of a campaign then. And I'm like, oh, so that's the first iteration of what is now Vagrant Sun. But I think more practically, I think the system itself is so much more important than the setting. Because the system, for me at least, nowadays, the way I go about writing, the way I go about sort of preparing games, is that I'm very aware that people are playing my game of Vagrant Sun. We're not just, you know, reading a story. I come from theatre and theatrical play musical background as well. And so, you know, the bells and whistles are important, but at the end of the day, we are telling a story. And that story is through the means and the motives of something. And in this case, it's a tabletop game. And so I think both of them inform each other in a very circular way. When I'm making it like a session, for example, I have a game coming up on Saturday with my long-term table friends. I'm thinking specifically about the game in terms of what am I going to introduce that's fun? What is the game that we're playing for the weekend rather than the story? Because I think a very almost Tolkien-esque approach to writing the story is that nothing is ever so important as when somebody's asking me a question about the world of Vagrant Sun. If somebody asks me a question like, oh, how did this faction learn to perform this kind of magic? Maybe about 7 out of 10 times I know the answer, but every other time I probably don't already. So the world building is happening as we're playing the game, or as it's actually, as the game itself is taking place. So like in terms of what came first, I think, especially in the way that I like to GM, I'm a very much a yes and GM, and I'm very much a yes and game designer. If somebody says, hey, it'd be cool to do this, I'm like, oh yeah, let's try it. Let's put this in a playtest and see if it works. It doesn't always work. I'm always I would much prefer to make and sort of craft an area of play around something that people are interested in. And all of the world of Sun, aside from maybe 7 or 8 facets, like, you know, the core pantheon, the continents that are present there, the way in which magic works, you know, the whole like angels, demons, devils, gods sort of idea, those things work, are very set in stone. And so they came before the game. But everything else is so much more a conversation with players and playtesters that I think the game always comes first, and then the story and setting comes afterwards, because suddenly we need to come up with something to, you know, a universe to play in. So yeah, I think actually thinking about it, I'm very much you know, we're playing a game, so I have to think about mechanics and systems first, and then we sort of begin to embellish around it afterwards with a really solid bedrock of lore that sits underneath that's unchanging. Yeah, I suppose that's my response to that. Yeah. It's still an evolving world. There's still a lot to write. There's still a lot of pages and chapters left that are unwritten, but what is written has come out of gameplay. So yeah, game first, setting second.
Which definitely makes sense, and I don't think either one is the better approach, but the attitude I've always told people is pick a damn lane. Like if you're going to be setting agnostic, or you're going to be built around a setting, it's important to nail that down instead of playing halfsies.
Yes, I agree.
Some of the more litigious games out there don't want to put their foot down one way or the other, or they'll say, oh, you can use this to run any kind of fantasy, but it's very clearly skewed towards a particular regional type of fantasy. Like someone saying, oh, you can use this to run any kind of high fantasy, but the spells, weapons, races, classes, all of that stuff very much leans towards a Western European pastiche.
Yes.
And where I sit on that kind of thing is, don't piss on my head and tell me it's raining.
Yeah, it really is a valid way of putting it, I think.
Mm-hmm. But
I think that's probably the challenge that every designer has to go through at some point, where they have to decide whether they're making a hack of another game, whether they're just essentially writing a book that has a game built around it, or whether they want to design something that's completely unique to themselves. Mm-hmm. And you do have to make that decision. I think I've probably left myself a bit too open-ended by starting off only making playtest material that's all very hackable and very open. But every time I go through and I read it and I make edits and I receive playtest feedback and go through and make changes, I can't help but notice how, my first playtest is very mechanical. It has a lot of theoretical setting stuff in it about sort of the genre and the tone that's being set. But then all the way through, I can see myself changing my mind. Actually, you know what? We are heading towards something that's much more setting specific. And at each of those points, I have to make the decision: am I putting the nouns, the words, the lore into this part of the game and turning it into the story, or am I sticking to my initial conceit and going, no, actually, we're building a game. The game is the most important part. We actually need the grass, the ground, the seeds, the bedrock first before we actually turn it into something that is a fully fleshed out setting. And when I get around to completing and compiling the final piece that is Vagrant Sun, a TTRPG, it's completely cogent and in and of itself a full game and setting. But everything up until that point, I think I've tried to leave it as open as possible in terms of what it is specifically, because if I make something and it's not fun, I would much rather be told that and then make the change before I get too invested. Before I go, well, if you say it sucks, then my story sucks. Where actually it's just that putting mechanics that aren't fun and that people aren't enjoying and people would much rather play something else. Yeah, it's a compromise. But I just like the game part of it. I love dice. I love cards. I love the numbers and the mechanics behind stuff. I think that's, as a designer, the thing that we forget about in lieu of just trying to make the story work. But I think when you focus on that from that perspective, you really have to put more time into it to make a game work as a whole.
You can have as much story as you want, but at the end of the day, this is still a game. And
absolutely,
I will admit that when I've stated that kind of thing, I've gotten the accusation of having a low opinion of story games. I really don't. But I do think that some of the people who are adherents for story games or more narrativist games are a little bit too up their own ass at times about the storytelling.
Yes. And
I remember something that my mentor had always said to me, which is, a novelist is shorthand for a shit DM.
Well, I mean, there's some logic to that. I can understand that.
There's some logic, but he was very blunt about things. I could kind of liken him to being the Gordon Ramsay of tabletop, because if you screwed up in a particular way, he would lay into you and make you feel like you're 5 feet tall.
Okay, yeah. There is something very important about brutal honesty, especially in game design. There is so much on the internet. Nobody has the time to wait until you get your point together, because there's so much other stuff that we could be looking at. Especially in tabletop space, there are so many people that don't actually know what they want. They just know that what's in front of them isn't it. And so entitled to say that, like, oh, this sucks, I want this kind of thing instead. And they'll talk about this theoretical thing that's better that it is what they're looking for, whether it's story based or mechanics based, if it's a game or fiction in general. They'll talk about it as if like, this thing that you have, I want it to serve this purpose that I want. But there are so many other things that they could go out and find that would serve their purpose.
Yeah.
And not everything is for the same mold. There's so many games out there that might do things better, and so many people that end up making their own games out of sheer necessity that they're looking for something different, and that's okay. You're allowed to like something different, but it's when it's like, I don't like that, so I'm gonna shit on that because it's not what I want. It's a really interesting sort of, it's not a balanced conversation, and people get hurt feelings about it all the time, but everyone wants difference.
Yeah, my approach has been because I'm good, because when I started this whole endeavor 10 years ago, I had the mindset of there was a lot of people who insist on this kind of mysticism as if tabletop is something where angels fear to tread, and I fully intend on cutting through the bullshit and just saying exactly how things are, and that has stepped on some people's toes and hurt some people's feelings, and I've just said, then you should, if you don't want your feelings hurt, then you shouldn't be putting your stuff out there, because people are.
It's hard putting, but people are so quick to get hurt feelings about stuff. You're right, and I think it's useful to have that mindset in tabletop games, video games, or whatever it happens to be, fantasy, sci-fi, in those fields, because people, like I said before, it exists in the minds of the people that play it, that enjoy it. They have a particular idea of how things work, and it's probably different than the general global consensus of how things work. And the open discourse is kind of useful. Being told that you're wrong, even if eventually you find out that actually you're right and you just didn't have the words to say it, is a kind of a useful place to be. And that is, in many ways, where the internet as a whole is really useful, because you get all these perspectives and you're allowed to disagree. You know, people are allowed to say, I don't agree with what you have to say about that. You know, they can have opinions about what the best game is, what the best IP is, and all of it's fine. Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's actually 100% right.
I've taken the approach of I need more than just feelings. is the approach I've taken. Yeah. Like if you really feel that strongly about it, you should be able to say more than that's just my take.
Exactly.
Otherwise, that's all that I'm going to see it as. And
feeling is so important in that conversation. You know, there's a big difference between somebody saying, this series that I love is the best series ever, compared to this is my favorite series for this, that, and the other reason. Both are two very different perspectives. You know, somebody can say, it's not my favorite, and suddenly you can have a conversation. But when you say this is the best, somebody is allowed to say, I disagree with you. And that's not a personal affliction, you know? It's not a way to hurt your feelings. You're allowed to disagree in it, and it doesn't open it up to a conversation to be like, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Which is, you know, the ideal discourse to have. But we all get enough feelings about things we care deeply about, that's for sure. Maybe too much.
And I know it's going to sound obvious, me coming from me being a gaming monk, but I try to distance myself from that as best I can. Now, one of the things that I did find a bit interesting when I looked at the different variants of character sheets and the way it ends up working is this sort of skill and action matrix that you've developed.
Yes.
With tying into the standard 6 ability scores, but each of them having a set of skills that they are tied to, as well as the different role types.
Yes, absolutely. There's sort of the core 3 facets of the SRD. Yeah. It's funny going back and looking at it. I can't help but feel like there's too much there. The playtest is designed in such a way that I wanted people to be able to take the things that they want and didn't have to use everything. The game at the end, like once it's all completed, will include all those facets. You know, the core 6 ability scores, the 18 different skills, and then all the different ability dice. The only bit that really matters of that entire table is the ability dice table, and everything informs that. But the reason why I had so many skills to begin with is because I wanted to steal from some games that I felt like had the language that I was looking for, that I wanted to use as a base to build on top of. And the 3 different skills next to each thing, so, strength, having power, training, and something else I can't remember off the top of my head. And force actually comes directly from the player's handbook. Those 3 terms come directly from the player's handbook. Mm-hmm. It's the same for each thing. I wrote them out in a line. I'm like, this is interesting because it's never brought up again. And I used that as an array to determine skills. Rules is written, each stat has 3 different skills in Vagrant SRD, but actually the way that the game is played, because you only have a small selection of skills that you're trained in, for example, you actually only end up choosing a handful of them. And so there is grounds to actually play the game in such a way that you use one stat, many different stats to essentially empower a singular skill. Mm-hmm. An example of that is power. I think there's something to be said that if you're trained in power, just thinking of it as through the perspective of like a frontline fighter, a sword and shield type character, mm-hmm. you would use power as your skill that represents your force in battle, right? But for a perhaps more linguistic character that has a force of presence and a charm, they might actually end up using power as sort of their force of personality. So if they're trained in power, they would use their charisma stat combined with their power skill to represent their force of personality. Mm-hmm. And the way in which that works is entirely a conversation with the GM. And it's a lot to get your head around if you're very familiar more with a sort of a flatlined approach of, this stat goes with this skill. Mm-hmm. The idea is mix and match, and you don't have to use every skill on the sheet. Very complex to start off with to look at just from the base level, but they're designed to be mixed and matched. And for the most part, once you've built your character, there will be a lot of different skills you mostly ignore, mm-hmm. and you can block out, put a black line through them or whatever. But there are, of course, also opportunities for the GM to say, I know that you're trained in this skill, but actually I think in this situation, I want you to use a different skill with that stat to represent that this is going to be more challenging for you. That's kind of the approach that they have in playtest 1 and 2 anyway. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of skills in Vagrant SRD. There are a lot of different options. I've gone for a really broad approach when it comes to character building. In actual play, you actually use a lot fewer different skills, especially if you're trying to play a very qualified, heroic, or a very well-prepared character, let's say.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And when it comes to the way classes work, I do find it interesting that you had split it into 3 categories: Moon, Star, and Sun.
Yes. I was kind of done away with classes mostly all together and gone for these Sun, Moon, and Star. We call them legacies. So you essentially have sort of a path that your character holds down. Yeah. Yes. There is something to be said that those different options, which you could conventionally call character classes, could be ignored completely for the most part. They mostly, what they offer you is a range of different traits, which gives you like different actions you can do. It gives you a high or a low chance of success on different things. It changes some of your skills in some ways. But the idea being, and the way that it works in Vagrant, is that Sun paths are very much about pursuing a particular talent or skill to mastery. Your goal is to be, if you're a fighter, you will be the best and the utmost fighter and an inspiration to others if you go down a Sun path. So things like the path of the Guardian, the path of the Wanderer, or the path of the Soldier, very representative of like martial classes in conventional games. But for the most part, the skeleton of it is about pursuing a singular path of mastery. Whether that be weapon mastery, whether that be mastery of a particular skill, but being so incredibly good at that thing that you inspire others to greatness as well.
And
Moon ambitions are on.
And
that's right.
It's funny you're about to go into the whole thing with the Moon ambitions, and what I find interesting there is while there's definitely the caster present, a lot of the problems that end up happening with caster archetypes in fantasy games aren't as present because of the fact that it's not doing the traditional spell list or the or some of these spells per day thing that I ranted about before we went live.
Yeah. Well, this was the whole Moon Ambition section of Vagrant SRD was my attempt to solve that problem myself, because I completely agree with you in the way that it functions especially in fantasy games with spell slots and spells per day type things. I wanted it to feel more like the list of actions that you had were magical in nature. They were as a result of your magical training, and you have like a reserve of energy in Vagrant SRD. It's called ether. It could be mana, could be anything, whatever it is you want to call it. You have a reserve of that, and there are different higher and lower level magical actions. They're based purely on the way in which you learned your magical profession.
Mm-hmm.
And like they follow, the cleric, druid, wizard type archetypes, but it's more about sort of your relationship with magic than it is anything else. And again, you could ignore the entire, because there's a later playtest. I want to say it's playtest 9 on my head. No, it is playtest 10, which is Write Spells and Powers. That gives you a massive list of spells you could have, but I think for the most part, it's more about creating a list of actions that you, the player, would be interested in doing. If you wanted to become a fire mage, what types of actions would you have, and how would we do that? And again, it's more of a conversation with the GM, but it does away with the spells per day and sort of does more of a, we understand magic in this game is a powerful force, a very chaotic force. It doesn't always go in your favor. How do you channel that? How do you interact with it? All those different kind of things in sort of a more like your skill is in the conservation and the practice of magic. So how do you use your skills to enact magic in front of you?
Mm-hmm.
That was my thesis anyway. Practically speaking, I think from my personal perspective, I would have loved to have put maybe a few more bells and whistles into that, into Moon Ambitions, to make it feel a little bit more like there are more options. But by the time we get to the final TTRPG with the final release, it'll be a very fleshed out sort of avenue that includes a lot of custom actions that you can perform that are much more coded towards spellcraft or sorcery or druidic type magic, whatever it is you want to do. It'll feel a little bit more like that. I actually stole quite a lot of inspiration from the way in which the Dark Souls games get you to learn magic, in that you need a teacher and you need to find an appropriate book and you need to spend time with that teacher to teach you the things. That kind of logic was how I kind of was inspired to do Moon Ambitions.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And of course, when it comes to, even with the brokenness that can happen with spells in the Dark Souls games, I would also counter that that the spells are not the sole problem. There is so much in terms of busted ass builds in Souls, especially in PvP, that has become kind of a joke, that it goes beyond broken and into levels of broken that are beyond mortal comprehension.
Yeah, and to the point where it's not fun anymore. Mm-hmm. I have a really hard time for that reason indulging in PvP in those style games, because when there is a broken build, everything else is obsolete. You've mastered the game when you get that build, and you press the button and you win. That doesn't feel like fun anymore,
I did get a bit more of enjoyment out of the way that Infernal Plus had modified it. And the thing is that happened by accident. It started because he had a dumb idea of wanting to put Blood Gulch into Dark Souls, and things just escalated from there. Then again, this is the same person who tried to make the longest Warthog possible, to the point where the engine started to break. Or he wanted to put he had joked about wanting to put tribes physics in Halo 2. And resulted in a frictionless Halo 2 game, and then made it even worse by multiplying the rate of fire for the pistol.
Okay,
so the pistol ends up feeling like a like a somewhat controlled SMG.
Nice.
Get
Fantastic.
of course the pistol in Halo is already infamous as it is, but
Yes.
when
I find that so interesting when people play with a game and then create something that's broken. They're like, "Oh no, the game's broken. You can't play it anymore." There's its own fun to be found in that as well, especially when something gets so broken to the point where it's silly and it feels like you've completely torn a game off of its hinges. You can find so much fun in that, and you begin to understand the game in such a better way. Making mods for games like that, or trying to make mods and failing, as the case may be sometimes, is such an integral part of gaming culture that I think sometimes it's just fun to do things that are broken.
Yeah, like it goes back to that whole thing I've said many times: no one plays Uno as written. Everybody's going to find ways to mess around with it, and that's also why I appreciate the games that understand that things are busted to a point, but part of the fun is finding those ways to break it. On the other hand, the reason I give the spellcasting in certain games as much shit as I do is because the brokenness there ends up stepping on the fun of other players. Like, why have the thief around when you can have a wizard cast knock and just completely, which is automatically going to hit, so it completely undermines the whole presence of lockpicking.
Yes, and I think that introduces a really interesting element of tabletop design, but RPGs in general, about the idea of balance and party composition, where you want to have different teams do it, different members do different things, but then there are so many games that want you to be able to do everything, and so they introduce spells like knock that allow you to to unlock things. That they find other ways to do that and to present your classic sort of broken multi-class builds. They can do a little bit of everything, but often they do things better than the pure class, and it's at that point you begin to wonder why we were worried about balance at all when you can kind of just do everything.
What's the perfect point of reference for designing classes and party composition, in my opinion?
Go ahead.
Team sports. Whether it be hockey, whether it be football, whether it be football, whether it be rugby, whether it be cricket, whether it be baseball. The fact that the fun factor is in understanding the team composition and the tactics involved with it.
What a perfect analogy that should be on the tip of everyone's lips, because it makes so much sense. In that if you don't stick to your role in a sports team, you ruin it for everyone else. If you go from being a defender and you're like, I've just decided that I'm going to be good at scoring, suddenly you lose. And it was your fault because you had a role to play. And the game is fun when you play your role, That is a perfect example. I really, really like that.
Not only that, but also the way formations work in a lot of team sports that end up making it a bit of a chess match.
Yes.
There are several YouTube channels I follow that break down film for different sports and why things didn't work out in certain ways. And when you understand that, I'll use American football as my example with this. So bear with me. But understanding things like the run pass option, understanding the importance of shotgun formations as opposed to tighter formations, the difference between the more wide open formations in college versus the tightly packed ones in the pros, or the reason why some teams are going to favor running and some teams are going to favor passing, and the ups and downs of that, then it ends up becoming a bit of a chess match. And that sort of understanding of formation, I do believe, can transfer into role-playing games when you build it around a team rather than a group of individuals.
I fully agree. I think that's an excellent example. I feel like I can offer a similar example from my experience, not in sport, but in like performance. The first thing that comes to mind is like in stage shows, but it's exactly the same metaphor, just with the sort of the roles changed around a little bit. In that, I think the classic case is like in a theatrical performance where people tend to think of the main characters, you know, the core cast, the lead characters, anyone with a name on stage fulfills a specific role, and they're the ones that people are looking for. But if you've ever watched amateur theatre, or you've been to see sort of like an up and coming band, they are really only as good as the ensemble. The show is only ever as good as the people that fulfill their role to the best extent. And 9 times out of 10, a really good, like a backup caster, maybe, you know, the backup singers, maybe it's the drummer, maybe it's the rhythm section. Doesn't matter what version you sort of use to explain it. Without them fulfilling their role, then a show really does look average and it's not as enjoyable. But that's also because the lead cast members, their job is to lead by example and to give people a point of reference as to how hard to work, what to do, what questions to ask, what kind of person they are determines the culture of the rest of it. And it's a perfect example of when people think their role is one thing, but is actually another thing, and they completely leave to the wayside all the things that they don't want to do. It all falls apart.
Yeah.
So it gives you the opportunity to make other people better and to make the rest of your party feel like a valid member of their team by just sticking in your damn lane and fulfilling that role as best as you can. And then, you know, there's always going to be situations in which that changes. We all have to react, and we all have to change perspective, and we have to, you know, we have to do things when new tasks come up, whatever. But it's so clear that party composition, there are so many clear examples of it in real life in which it actually works really well, and you're not just trying to give everybody the spotlight.
I brought up Ocean's 11 to you earlier before we went live, and look at the crew that Danny Ocean builds in that movie, and everybody has. There's no jack of all trades kind of individual. Everyone has their own particular area of expertise. You know, you've got one person who's good at captaining the ship, one who's good at the on the ground parts of leading the team. You know, you've got somebody who's handling tech, you've got somebody who's handling the slippery parts of things. You've got somebody who's handling the electronics and all of that. Even if he does a very, very poor Cockney accent in the process, but that's another story.
Yes.
But the point is it's a bunch of pieces in service to a unified whole. And
yes,
I will note that I did do stage acting, and I did do a bit of stunt work once upon a time. So I completely get that kind of thing. Especially when I was in a chamber play once, and the guy I was acting opposite forgot all his lines the day we do a show, so I had to feed him his lines while making it look like I wasn't.
Oh no, that's the nightmare. That's the nightmare. I've had to do it a couple of times myself.
He told me just as curtains were going up.
Oh no. We have community theatre here locally, so it's not like super professional, and the bar is set low enough that most people can do it. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you really get yourself put in a situation where it's not that you're underprepared, is that nobody can prepare you for having to pick up somebody else's pieces when they just don't put the work in to remember what they're meant to do, whether it's lines, whether it's cues, it doesn't matter what it is. When you're sitting there and you're just like, oh, so it falls to me to pick up the slack now? Thanks very much, man.
Yeah,
that's rough.
When that ended up happening, afterwards, I was my attitude was I'm going to do my best out of this right now, and then afterwards, when we get to the back, I'm putting you in a chicken wing.
Good, absolutely, probably deserves it too.
Which I did, and he ended. I've never. It's always amusing when I see someone with that deep of a voice scream so high pitched. He had no pain tolerance whatsoever. And I'm like, what the hell are you doing? I'm just wrenching your arm. Why do you gotta shout like that?
You found this so easy to react to, and yet it was so hard for you to remember your lines. Jeez, that's
Yeah,
something's wrong
there's
here.
been that. There's been the time that I had to corpse during I had to play a corpse on stage, and you know how it is. Everyone's going to try and make you crack.
Yep. Yep.
And
If you ever want to be humbled in terms of a skill that seems like it would be easy but is actually really difficult, it's staying perfectly still in front of an audience for longer than 60 seconds. That is a nightmare.
yeah, when I finally did, I ended up sitting up like I was the Undertaker or something, and then I see 8 people just run for the back, like I was about to rampage on them. And when I asked why, they were all like, "We thought you were gonna kill us," and I'm like, "Why would I do that? I can only do that once."
Yeah, exactly.
Now putting someone twisted into knots, or putting them in a bear hug for about a minute, that's another story.
Yes, no, you're right.
Uh,
All of these, honestly, perfectly relatable to tabletop games
Yeah.
because it's these types of shenanigans that are perfect representations of our actual experience playing games when people do foolish things and we have to pick up the pieces.
yeah, I've seen a lot of people act like we need to be more serious in our storytelling. I'm like, you can say that all you want, but it's not going to happen. Because no plan survives the first encounter, and if you want that kind of serious storytelling, I think you're better off writing a novel.
Yeah, especially when it comes from players. I have a very interesting relationship with my players in that I will always try to present a cogent story that is not necessarily always serious, but is like consistent. I try to keep it on the rails as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But that when a player does something that they'll fly off the rails, as a yes and style GM, I'm totally here for it. We're gonna go off the rails because it's what you want to do. You and I have built this social contract where you want it to go into some silly crackhead territory. We're gonna do that, and then somebody else tries to like swoop in and make it really serious, tries to change the tone of it. It's a little bit like you can't know but my yes and. You know, if you wanted it to be serious from the get-go, like introduce the seriousness. We'll do that from the top. I presented for you this stage to act on, and we've decided to go in a different direction. And I mean, when you have your conversation with players and with other people that play games, and they go, "I want it to be a particular way," and it doesn't work out that way, like they can play a different game. You don't have to stay around at a table that doesn't fit whatever it is that you want to do. And it's actually really hard to play it straight-faced most of the time. We're not all professional actors. We're not all doing this in front of a camera for money. We're just playing a game, and it's okay that it doesn't take itself seriously all the time. Some of the best parts of games like World of Warcraft are the fact that it's batshit insane. It's so dumb, but the game is fun because of it, you know? And it's no less like a serious game because of it. You can absolutely have fun, go off the rails and make it silly and make it less serious. And the game can still have meaning. It can still be meaningful. You can still have your deep and meaningful character moments that make people feel emotions and whatever, but it doesn't have to take itself seriously.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I do find it interesting the way you've handled combat in this almost zone-like design through things like the scenario system.
Yeah, pitch scenarios was a left of center thing. I didn't expect to go quite so far off the rails. It was a natural sort of recourse of where playtest was going and what people were interested in. Because I think, this is purely from my perspective, I think combat TTRPGs are a game in and of themselves. You can scrap away any of the other mechanics of a game like Pathfinder, D&D, whatever it happens to be, and there is a whole game there. And they do it better and do it worse than other games. Those things are purely in the minds of the people that want to play those games. And like, I wanted Vagrant SRD to have a combat element to it, but I didn't want it to be the emphasis of what all these characters could do. So like, I mean, there is still combat, but the way in which I chose to build the pitch scenario section to playtest for, I presented 3 different scenarios, which are essentially like in any other game, it'd be the moment at which the GM says, okay, roll initiative, we're going to take turns. But they're built in such a way that says they can go into conflict or they can go into a different kind of resolution if you wanted to. So, like, I think the perfect example is the skirmish pitch scenario, which is just the idea that three on three, there are 3 bad guys, 3 good guys. If you didn't want to go into combat, it's simply a matter of placing your pieces down and finding a way to get as far away as possible from the conflict that's going on. And you may not even get to the point where you're rolling dice. It may just be a simple matter of the conversation between those two things. And the GM then moves the characters' tokens from close to the middle to far away until they're all moved away from that. We can use that as sort of like the way in which we represent how that scenario played out. But for conflicts and for anything that sort of resembles combat, you could also use it for that as well, because the action economy in Vagrant SRD is that you get 2 actions per turn, and then you get to use a support action, which is like a bonus action or a reaction. So it's really, really slimmed down to only a small number of options per turn. And it's just used as a frame of reference to be able to map out things like if the character is hidden, if the character is in base-to-base contact, if you're casting a spell, how far can that spell go? If you're firing an arrow, how far can that arrow go? Used purely as a frame of reference for those kind of mechanical details. Aside from that, it's mostly just an additional component that you could use. It's not core to the main part of the game. Mm-hmm. But it felt very disingenuous not to have something that resembled combat, because it is just a cell-based game. You're just moving from one piece to another. Ideally, in a turn, you'll move from one space closer or further away, and then you use your action to perform something, whether it's a spell or an attack or one of your skills, your abilities to try and fix something, whatever it happens to be. And then you move on to the next person.
Yeah,
it's the simplest way that I could describe a low-stakes combat simulation. That was the idea that I was going for. But again, if you wanted to play Vagrant SRD and you wanted it to feel more like a war game, you don't have to play it like that.
Yeah.
And especially in playtest, you could emulate any kind of a skirmish game. If you're a Warhammer kid and you want to pull the minis out on the table, it's easy enough to take the ideas from that and to put it in there. Wouldn't for Vagrant SRD in the way that I play at my tables, I wouldn't. But it is certainly possible to go in that direction if that's something your table wants. But if you're going in that direction, I would probably also say to people like, well, maybe Vagrant SRD isn't the game you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And that's okay as well. It is designed to put combat in the back as something that's possible, but it's not part of the core. Like, you know, when people say what are the 3 pillars of D&D, combat isn't one of the core pillars of the TTRPG. Scenarios are, and playing out scenarios in a way that feels like a game is, but it doesn't necessarily have to be combat, sword and spells, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's my solution to building a game in which combat is de-emphasized, and it's more about building specific set pieces in which your characters get to show off their cool abilities and do whatever it is they need to do to get out of combat or out of conflict or resolve situations.
Mm-hmm. And where I stand in is that I will always have a degree of fascination when people find ways to put in combat systems that aren't exactly full theater of the mind, but aren't exactly the grid combat kind of wargame approach. Since I do think that there is room for a middle ground between those two extremes. Since
yes,
especially when you're trying to do things that are going to be more in the cinematic style, or even just not a war game, because TTRPGs have moved past that association. Like, you have whole generations of folk who got into TTRPGs who had no background with wargaming.
Yes, yes.
I think because of that, this idea that we have to do grid combat, for example, is that really the question I often ask is that really the case, or is that some Stockholm syndrome going on? Not to sound too harsh.
Yes. No, I think I definitely agree with that. There's a point in time in which I considered making combat completely non-essential to my game, and it came from a point of my own experience as a GM and knowing how hard it is to pull off set piece encounters well in a way that feels satisfying. Sometimes all you want to do is leave it open and be like, oh, well, you know, because of a roll of the dice, suddenly you're in combat and this thing happens and things jump out of the woods and whatever it happens to be. And to add an element of I guess, the theater of the mind component of it, where sometimes something random can happen. But you can't prepare for all of those situations unless you have a massive pile of miniatures or you know, you've got graph paper on hand, you draw everything out because it stops the game or whatever. For my own benefit, I'm like, this feels like a nice middle ground where I can put the pitch scenario on the table. We can put some tokens down and go, cool. Everything slows down to a turn-based thing now, so that we can get to the point where it's very decision heavy. But then after that, it's kind of like, do you want to still be here, or do you want to try to get away from this? Because it's very clear from the get-go what it is that they want to do, and I'm not going to force my players to sit through what is otherwise a meaningless combat if it's not an important set piece. Yeah, like I say, it's mostly my way of trying to resolve that. But I think there are probably other ways, other games that do it better, and other games that present other better ideas. I'm just not trying to be those games, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's where I stand with what I feel works best for my table. Mostly because I just don't have the time to set up all the extra stuff. I'd love to have a giant collection of miniatures and stuff to put on the table. And I have so much respect for people that go to the extra mile to do that. But I just don't have the time nowadays to really invest in that. Much as I would love to, and I do love miniatures, I just don't have that extra time to do the preparation. And I wanted to provide a way to do that in Vagrant as well.
Yeah, and my approach has been one of, I don't really hyper focus on miniatures in the same way anymore. Not because of a time issue, but because the style of play that I go into, it's not something that is really all that compatible. Because have you ever read the book Blowing Up the Movies by Laws?
I think I have a copy of it, but I've not read it.
Oh.
I definitely haven't read it, but I think I own a copy of it somewhere.
Yeah. I try to go with this very cinematic approach, one that's very much inspired by, you know, the works of John Woo and the like.
Okay, yeah.
And because of that kind of specific positioning shouldn't be as important because I'm not running a war game.
Yes.
I mean, I think the only time that I even come close to running something war game like is, I think the times that I've run ones that either had that in mind, but I was a bit more liberal regarding how people could move. Like I think I did that once for a mech game where I added that there was your full movement action, but there were also minor bits of movement that you could make as reactions to certain things. It was my way of replicating the high mobility movement you see in a lot of mech anime and mech games, especially stuff like Armored Core, where you're always on the move.
Exactly, yeah. And there's so much sort of moment to moment decision making, I think, to do in those kind of games where it does actually matter for the theme of the game, for the theme of what you're actually trying to tell. Oh, yeah. But it doesn't matter for all games. And I think sometimes people also just... The reason why I think it's fine to have that kind of combat in games is because sometimes people just want to read off their abilities and they want to do the mechanical thing that makes sense. But it's not for everyone. And I think it's okay to not default to that, especially if you've got a game in which people aren't actually interested in that kind of thing. And that's not every table, and that's fine. But yeah, I think there are always going to be games that do combat better, but there are always also going to be tables that simply aren't that interested in those mechanical components to it. And if you really wanted to make a very combat heavy action reaction style game, there's so much out there about how you can make that style of game work and what mechanics to use and what types of games to pull from, that it feels disingenuous to try and build something from scratch to replicate it when there are so many different ways to do that already. And that's just, I mean, again, that's just my perspective on it. But it's my solution to what feels like the middle ground on my table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and having the option is always going to be important.
Yes,
Since
completely.
I've thought of myself as a tailor whenever it comes to how I review things. It's less about whether or not a game is good or not, and more about who I would recommend it to and how many asterisks I have to put on that recommendation. And the games that get registered as bad are the ones that I have to put too many qualifiers or too many asterisks on.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. I always find myself at an impasse whenever somebody asks me if I've played this game, and I might say no, maybe, or I might have said, oh, I played a little bit, and then they recommend me a game based on those games. It's like, if I have to understand it through the reference of all of this other material first to be able to enjoy it, am I actually going to enjoy it? Like, do I have to do the pre-reading before I'm able to play the game? Because it doesn't feel fun to me at that point. And the game doesn't necessarily feel like it's for me if I have to do all of this other stuff to make it work.
Mm-hmm. Now, with that in mind, what are the next steps planned for Vagrant?
That awesome question, honestly, because I'm just about to publish the 1.3 edition of the system reference document, which includes essentially a bunch of different changes to playtest 1 to 5, just to accommodate for the complete character sheet, because like I said, it was very much a hackable system up until the later playtests. I wanted to try and change it so that the language is a little bit more cohesive, that it all references back to the character sheet, that it's just a print and play sort of paper and pen style of building a character. And from that point onwards, the rest of my year, aside from a few other projects, like releasing some other music for Vagrant Sun and doing a few other little soundtrack type things and posting tons of lore online, trying to do some videos and whatever, is the full game itself. So all 11 parts of the playtest will essentially become the full game. And the book will be a singular book for GMs and players. The idea being that for the most part, the game is the same regardless of whether you're running it or you're a player in it, with a few caveats, naturally. But that I'm aiming for about October of this year. The hardest part of the work has been done, but at the moment, my main goal is essentially working on things like illustrations and artwork and the publishing and where I'm going to publish it. I'm also looking into some crowdfunding options, all that kind of stuff. And that's going to be probably closer to October this year for the full release. I'll be running tons of playtests and trying to have a lot of conversation with people online about Vagrant SRD and the ways in which you can hack it and play it in different settings and different systems. But the game itself is coming out later this year. That's the main goal for me, in and amongst just a few other minor projects. But publishing the full thing. It'll be on itch.io. I use that as my point of reference, but I also have a personal storefront for it as well. But that's my whole year, is working on this game, essentially.
Oh, yeah. And I'll look forward to it. But with all that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here.
I'm so glad, Mildred. I'm really grateful to be able to sit and chat about stuff. Just in general, talk TTRPGs and games and stuff. I know that we kind of enjoy very similar games, and it's been really fun to talk about it and to talk about Vagrant SRD.
Yep. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Yeah, what a way to be. What a way to live, really. I'll definitely be checking out all the stuff in regards to Final Fantasy TTRPG. I think that's a phenomenal thing, and I think so many people will enjoy that as well.
Yeah. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.